Yeah, it would.
in 3D.
Three.
Yes, you're live now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alejandro Paz. I'm the moderator for our panel today on anti-Palestinian racism, or demystifying anti-Palestinian racism, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. I'm going to be super quick with land acknowledgement, and then we'll get started because we don't have tons of time. I'm speaking from the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca and the Mississaugas of the Credit, as well as the home of many Indigenous peoples, and where there has been a treaty known as a dish with one spoon, one palm for several hundred years. I ask you also today to think about where you are in this moment. And since we are speaking of some of the ways that Palestinians are dispossessed by the Israeli settler colonial project, I also ask everyone to think of El Wal Nes, the land of the people of Palestine. Thanks to Beverly Bain and Min Sukli for organizing, Alessandra Jordan for the tech support, and to my wonderful panelists, Daniel Farra, Jasmine Zine, and Cheryl Nestle. To save time, I'm just going to throw the bios in the chat, and our order will be Dalia, Jasmine, Cheryl, and then me. I'm going to keep time, and I will jump in at about 12 minutes to let folks know that there's 3 minutes left. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dalia.
Thank you, Alejandro. Shukran. So my name is Dalia Farra. I'm a Palestinian Canadian, originally from the Gaza Strip. That's where my father's family is from. And I will be fast today, but what I want to do is take a minute to kind of share what the past few months have been like for us here. And it's been surreal. For us, it hasn't just been something that is happening on the other side of the world. It's really affecting every facet of our existence these days. For me, it's been very surreal seeing my own family name and my children's family name being reported in the news as casualties. Um, as of now, we've lost over 300 members from both sides of the family, from over 250 from my side alone. Now, my father was in the Gaza Strip on October 7th when that happened, but at one point he was able to evacuate because he had a second citizenship. But most people there aren't lucky. And plus, the border has been, the Rafah border has been closed and occupied by the Israeli occupation forces since, I believe, April or May. And no one can get in or out. And most people there don't have that privilege of a second citizenship where someone can evacuate them. My parents, my uncles, aunts, and cousins have all lost their homes, their businesses, their clinics, their livelihoods in the nonstop attacks. My background is actually a view from my parents' home taken September 2023 in Gaza. And that view and the home it was photographed from no longer exists. Here, I don't know I hope the audio is working, but the music. But my uncle shared some pictures. These are a dear relative, my father's cousin, who lived in our ancestral home, my grandfather's home. Took it upon himself to sift through the rubble and take some of our, find some of our mementos and pictures. And I know it seems like an insignificant thing to dwell on, but really it just heightens that feeling of violation that we feel constantly. Like the most intimate and personal part of our life has been desecrated, shattered open, and exposed, and stolen from us. Now, I will not share graphic images or videos, but I really do want to convey how bad things are on the ground in a very small way. It's very hard to really wrap our heads around. Just like we can't cover everything. So I will share some descriptions. They might be a little graphic, but feel free to turn off your audio for a minute if you don't want to hear them. I've seen a picture of my cousin's sons, both of them, 14 and 16, lying as the ground, shot dead. by the occupation forces as they were buying bread for their family. I've watched a father cradle his newborn daughter who died because of the cold overnight in their tent. I've seen videos of the cemeteries in Khan Yunis and Gaza, including the one where my grandparents are buried, being razed and desecrated. I've seen images of a woman with her face blown out, her left eye hanging from the socket, and that's an injury. She's alive, but that's an injury she's going to deal with the rest of her life. And I've watched dozens of videos, hundreds of videos of completely destroyed residential civilian areas, neighborhoods and homes, including my own. So I do want to take a minute to remember, to remind everyone and remember why we're here, that these are humans, these are people, and they all have lives and dreams. Now, the question always comes up, what does it matter here in Canada? This past year, 13 months actually now, I've really grappled with my sense of belonging and where I am in the grand scheme of things, and that constant feeling of being othered and being treated like someone who isn't worthy of dignity or basic human rights. And this isn't just me, it's a very common sentiment I speak whenever I speak to anyone from the Palestinian community and Arabs and Muslims in general here in Canada. Our whole sense of belonging and belief in Canada as a diverse, equitable, multicultural place has been shaken to its core. And this is because the systems that are meant to protect us, media, law enforcement, political systems, education, healthcare, everything has made us feel less than, like we're vulnerable and our rights don't matter. And we're definitely facing unprecedented levels of anti-Palestinian racism. So what does it look like, anti-Palestinian racism? There's a big overlap between anti-Palestinian racism, anti-Arab racism, and Islamophobia, and my colleague Yasmin will speak to that in a bit. But APR is a very distinct and unique form of racism, which is perpetrated against Palestinians and supporters of Palestinian human rights as a whole. It silences, excludes, erases, defames, and dehumanizes Palestinians and their narratives. So some of these examples are justifying violence against Palestinians, defaming them and their allies, accusing them of being anti-Semitic, weaponizing that anti-Semitism against them, erasing human rights, dignity, and worth of Palestinians, excluding them from narratives, and failing to acknowledge Palestinians as an indigenous peoples with a collective identity. This is done in so many ways: disciplining, reprimanding, dismissing Palestinians and their supporters, and of course, by creating such a fear of being reprimanded that people are afraid to speak out, and in some cases, even afraid to identify as Palestinian publicly. So we can write encyclopedias of case studies of examples of anti-Palestinian racism, especially in this past year. But what I will share are just a few examples, and I really do hope my audio is working. I'll explain in a bit what this is. This happened at a school in Ontario. Thank you, Alejandro. This is a high school teacher in Ontario who referred to a student as a terrorist or looking like a terrorist because he had a kufiya wrapped on his head. In the interest of time, we won't watch it all. There are a couple more, so. Another example is doxing. And I've removed the names and the pictures of people here. This is from the Canary Mission website, which is a website that is the sole purpose is to dox people, mostly academics and students, but everyone, and try to get them blacklisted. And so doxing is the act of revealing personal information about people online without their consent. it includes their address sometimes, their workplace, their phone number, financial information in some cases. And it comes from the term dox, as in dropping documents, dropping that personal information. So people can use it against them and harass them. And it can range from threats to in-person harassment, cyberbullying, requests for removal from their place of business or their place of study. Here's another example that we saw happen this year, where a human rights commissioner was supposed to start their new role, but through advocacy from Zionist lobbying organizations, was asked to resign and step down before starting. And the claim was that some of his pro-Palestinian statements in the past were deemed anti-Semitic. Again, another example of that weaponizing of anti-Semitism, which my colleagues will speak about again in a bit. Hate speech and threats.
Sorry, Dalia, we don't hear the audio from the video, just to let you know.
Sorry, Alejandro?
I actually, we can't hear the audio from the video.
Oh, that's unfortunate. It is someone using language that I won't repeat, but it's very threatening, and it's hate speech and really bad language. Counter protesters. This one, if there's no audio here, it's okay because it is an example of police brutality. And of course, if you are triggered by this, please look away for about 30 seconds. This was at a peaceful protest. And on the next slide has it's more about police brutality and it has some blood in it. Again, if you want to look away. This happened in March 2023 at a peaceful protest, and this young man ended up in the ER along with 15 other Palestinian demonstrators who were peacefully protesting. And this one is very personal for me because this young man is my son. So when we talk about anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobia, Islamophobia really relies on the Orientalist depictions of Arab and Muslims, where colonialism and occupation underpin anti-Palestinian racism in ways it doesn't with Islamophobia. It really has unique features that aren't shared with Islamophobia. So some of those unique features are the narrative that Palestinians don't exist, in contrast to the presence, the exaggerated presence in of xenophobic fear, amplified and exaggerated in the case of Islamophobia, that fear mongering. That notion that Palestinian identity is controversial and complicated, the systemic repression and vilification of Palestinian humanity, that compounding trauma of an ongoing violent oppression and violent occupation and oppression. And some of the impacts is that Islamophobia, when it's used as a catch-all, it erases the existence of Palestinians who are not Muslim. It also, APR also compounds Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism, further isolating Palestinians while also reinforcing existing oppressions. And the compounded hatred can lead to brutal violence against visible Palestinians and Muslims in general. And such as the example of the young men, Palestinian men in Vermont who were shot for wearing their kufiyas, and the killing of 6-year-old Wadi al-Fayoum, and police brutality here in Toronto and other university campuses everywhere. And again, sorry. Yeah. Time? Okay, thanks. Framing Palestinian human rights as a religious conflict also removes the occupation and settler occupation narrative from the framework. Again, we talked about the anti-Semitism smears, and that is the most prevalent form of anti-Palestinian racism, and that includes any criticism of Israel, being anti-Zionist and supporting BDS. And that you can tell if you read up on the IRA definition that a lot of it is based on that. It gives a lot of credence to the IRA definition. And I think this link will be shared in the chat of this article by a former Hillel executive director at Harvard. It's important to keep in mind that the Israeli narrative would like people to assume that the issues are about religion and anti-Semitism, but criticism of Israel is not necessarily anti-Semitic. Top forms of anti-Palestinian racism, based on a recent study, was excluding or erasing Palestinians in their narratives, defaming Palestinians generally, denying Palestinian indigeneity to Palestine, and denying the Nakba. The worst APR offenders, media here in Canada, is, as you can see, Honest Reporting Canada, again, is a Zionist website that's purely there to perpetuate anti-Palestinian racism and lobby against Palestinian protests and activism. And I'm sorry, I'm going a little fast, Alejandro. I have a couple of minutes and I'll be done. But I do think this one's important because a lot of these phrases and words come up a lot in the discourse now, and it's important to explain them, I think. The Intifada literally comes from an Arabic word meaning nafa, to shake off. And it is used in the Palestinian resistance context as a grouping of any activism, any efforts to free Palestinians from the occupation and the oppression and the apartheid that they are living. From the river to the sea is, again, it is an anti-apartheid phrase, where it's not a genocidal phrase. It's not calling for violence against Jewish people. And part of accusing Palestinians of having inherently violent or genocidal tendency is a form of APR. Palestinians don't want to subjugate, dominate, or oppress anyone. They deserve equal rights on their ancestral lands, and that is what the phrase means. And again, martyr, shaheed, comes from, it refers to everyone killed by Israel in the fight for against oppression and injustice. And it also comes from a root Arabic word meaning shahad, witness. And basically it's the highest form of witnessing oppression. So 2 more slides, Alejandro.
Okay, we're
we
almost at 17 minutes, just so you know.
Okay, incorporating APR into EDI work, again, as we do with any anti-racism work, analysis of the power dynamics, making sure to really examine the dynamics of power in the equation. This is not an equal war or a conflict, as is said. It's not 2 equal forces moving against each other. It's the occupation by one of the most powerful militaries on earth, and backed and financed by some of the most powerful militaries and forces on earth, where Palestine has weakened infrastructure, no military, and significantly less support. Again, calling out injustice and using active voices. You see this in the media a lot. For example, instead of saying over 45,000 Palestinians dead, we should be, media and us, even in our own narratives, we should be more clear of Israel has murdered 45,000 people, including 18,000 children. The active voice helps with that accountability. And again, using precise terms and concepts like genocide. This is not a conflict. Really use those terms. No oppression Olympics. We don't pit one form of violence and oppression against each other. There has been a rise of anti-Semitism, and we can call it out without trying to divert attention when people are trying to stop a genocide. Of course, no generalization. Not everyone who supports Palestinian freedom necessarily has to be a supporter of Hamas, for example, or needs to be asked to condemn Hamas. And asking or generalizing is a form of anti-Palestinian racism. And of course, as in any anti-racism work, allyship and healthy debates and bringing new learning into academic spaces. And when it comes to decolonizing education, always that reminder of whose voices are not being heard, whose narratives are being shared, and who's doing the sharing in mainstream media and scholarship. I think that's all. I'll stop sharing. I think there's going to be Q&A at the end, right, Alejandro?
Yeah, hopefully we'll have time for some Q&A. Thank you so much, Dalia. That was both really powerful and really useful. And of course, our
Alejandro.
Deep condolences for the loss of your family. Next up is Jasmine. Jasmine, do you have audio?
Sorry, I'm just trying to now unmute and start my video. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah, we see your screen. Do you have audio to play?
No, I'm not playing audio.
Okay,
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay,
hear you.
All right. Thank you very much. And thank you so much, Dalia, for starting us out in such a powerful way. And I add my deepest condolences for the irreplaceable loss of your family. This is actually the 5th panel that we've all done together since the start of this year. And each time I'm struck by how the death toll in Dalia's family has risen. And so I also just want to acknowledge how Dalia and her family truly embodies the spirit of Samud, or the steadfast perseverance, grace, and fortitude in the face of challenging oppression. And that is something that we've seen in all Palestinians in this horrible genocide. I'm also appreciative to the Scholars Strike Canada Forum to address the concerns within our campus communities in relation to APR, academic freedom, surveillance, policing, and the militarization on our campuses. However, I was dismayed that the description of this forum failed to include Islamophobia or reference to targeted Muslims. And I want to warn against such erasures for several reasons that I'm going to cover in my presentation. But I'll flag one of those reasons right off the top, and that is that excluding the term Islamophobia is precisely what pro-Israel groups have been trying to orchestrate for decades. So I'm going to just go through and hopefully keep to the time. So just so that we're on the same page of what Islamophobia is and isn't, it is not an irrational fear of hatred of Islam, as the name might imply. Rather, it's rooted in racial logics embedded in colonial and Orientalist histories. It doesn't mean that you cannot be critical of Islam as you would any other religion, and it doesn't mean you can't criticize the policies and practices of Muslim majority countries. Many of us who are Muslim do that as well. And so what it is that it's a system of oppression. And I'll break some of that down as we go along. Anti-Muslim racism is a manifestation of Islamophobia, of how that discrimination is enacted on Muslim bodies, and is tied to the racialization of religion, whereby race has become a proxy for religious identity. And so Islamophobic hate and bigotry are translated into individual actions that are informed by negative ideologies and stereotypes, and those find expression in laws and policies, and that's the systemic level. So Islamophobia is also intersectional, and why we are focusing on APR, we need to remember that Islamophobia is the architecture upon which anti-Palestinian racism was built, and the other intersections as well. So there's also anti-Arab racism, again, which is adjacent to APR and Islamophobia and is intersectional, anti-brown racism, anti-Black racism, and of course, gendered forms of Islamophobia are also distinct in the way that they apply to how Muslim women, for example, have been, part of negative Orientalist stereotypes, as well as Muslim men who are often coded through the terrorist, jihadist, radical kinds of tropes. Islamophobia is also a global phenomenon, and so while we are now sadly familiar with what is happening in the genocide in Palestine, there is also the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar, the genocide of the Muslim Uyghurs in China, as well as state repression of Muslims in India and Kashmir. And so while it's important to be acknowledging other genocides in relation to what we're witnessing now, and often we hear of also of Sudan, but we're really not hearing as much about the Uyghurs and the Rohingya. In China alone, there's 1 million Muslims who are interned in camps there. So that's a whole other presentation, but I just wanted to flag the global dimension. Also, I think a lot of what we've witnessed over the last 13 months, for me, harkens back to post 9/11 and what we were witnessing then with the global war on terror, which has continued on. I wrote a book looking at the impact of Islamophobia and on the 9/11 generation, a generation that was socialized into the world where the global war on terror affected everything, including their campus politics and experiences. But what's significant to note now is that what we're seeing is a lot worse because of the fact that Islamophobia has done its job for the last more than 20 years since 9/11. And it has laid the groundwork that's made it easier to collectively label and punish Muslim populations. The global war on terror has been underpinned by racist ideologies, casting nearly 2 billion people around the world as violent, fanatical terrorists who threaten the democracy, stability of white nations, and Western civilization. What's also significant now that we didn't actually have in the post 9/11 context was that, the existence of social media. And we are now living in what's been characterized as a post-truth world, where disinformation campaigns, conspiracy theories, and Muslim scare stories are disseminated on social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and through scores of blogs and websites that didn't exist back in 2001. And there are now coordinated subcultures that globally traffic in these false narratives. We've also seen over the last 20 years and through the global war on terror, the fortification of the security industrial complex and the securitization of Muslims, including on our campuses. And that is a lot of what's undergirding the militarization and policing we're seeing at the moment. There's also the neo-McCarthyism and orchestrated censorship that is far more organized, as a lot of the groups and networks that are behind these campaigns have also become more organized over the last couple of decades. And Islamophobia and APR are something now that is affecting the new, we could say 10/7 generation, Gen Z youth in new ways that we are witnessing now through the immense activism and social movements that they've developed, and are also having other profound negative impacts on them as well. And so that's another area of, I think, scholarly inquiry that I'm hoping to examine. So I think what's significant to note about Islamophobia, unlike a lot of forms of oppression, is that it is organized, it is orchestrated, it is networked, and it is monetized. And so I wrote a very detailed book-length study on the Canadian Islamophobia industry that came out in 2002. And what we found was, coming off of studies that were done in the US about the Islamophobia industries there, this is the first study to look at Canada and the networks that have come together to demonize and marginalize Muslims and purvey Islamophobic ideologies. And so this industry is comprised of media outlets, what I call Islamophobia influencers, far-right white nationalist groups, think tanks and their designated security experts, pro-Israel, fringe right groups, and Muslim dissidents and ex-Muslims, as well as the donors that fund these campaigns. And so together, these individuals, groups, and institutions comprise a networked ecosystem that engages in activities to promote and purvey Islamophobic conspiracies and campaigns. And so here's an example of one we've seen recently. And of course, this is Rebel Media, was behind this truck that went around during the protests that were happening in support of Gaza, with a video screen on it, or a screen that was showing people praying outside during the protests, and then captions of wake up Canada, you're under siege, is this Iraq? also intimating that refugees from Gaza are, aligned with Hamas and all of these sorts of, creating moral panic and fear mongering. So that's one of the kinds of more recent campaigns, although there has been many, many of these kinds of campaigns that have brought together also a lot of what I call unholy alliances and a mixture of different actors and players and groups and organizations. So just on this screen here, you can see, for example, you've got the Jewish Defense League arm in arm with a white nationalist group, the Soldiers of Odin. And they were actually both providing security for this person here, Sandra Solomon, who is an ex-Muslim. And they were all convening to vilify an imam at the Toronto Mosque who had given a prayer and was accused of being anti-Semitic, although it was later found that recording had been mistranslated and sort of sliced and diced, and that there was a former IDF soldier behind the propagation of that particular video, not before this imam was fired and was also faced other kinds of sanctions. So that is bringing together some very odd alliances. Then also you have here, this is Ron Banerjee, who's part of a Hindutva activist group, and he's with Paul Frum, who is a very infamous white supremacist in Canada. And you can see them, this also group was something that Ron Banerjee was part of. World Canadian Alliance Against Islam, I believe, was the acronym. So these are just some few examples that I have, and my report has many, many of these examples of those alliances. There's also a lot of funding behind Islamophobia industries, and the studies that have been done are in the United States, and they've shown, here, for example, between 2008 and 2013, there was $204 million in revenue that was circulating amongst about here, I guess it's 74 different groups. And by 2013 alone, there was almost $35 million circulating between various Islamophobia industry groups in the United States who are solely set up for the purpose of doing this kind of anti-Muslim campaigns. A more recent report in 2019 was Hijacked by Hate by the Council of American Islamic Relations that showed that a staggering $1.5 billion circulates amongst 39 Islamophobia network groups, and this money is funneled through various philanthropic organizations through what they call donor-advised funds in the US. But that is the kind of money that is bankrolling the bigotry behind Islamophobia. Now, in Canada, we weren't able to do the same kind of forensic accounting they do in the US to look at the tax records and figure out where money is moving. But we were able to figure out that there were some Islamophobia industry funders that had connections in Canada, Gatestone Institute being one of them, the Middle East Forum, Clarion Project, and the Shulman Foundation. And in my report, I go into more detail about those connections and about these organizations, but it's just to give you a sense of how these networks are moving, north and south of the border. An example of some of the coordinated disinformation campaigns. This is one that came out recently, so it wasn't in my report, but it's very representative of what we've been witnessing over the last couple of decades. That this organization called United Citizens of Canada were posting content portraying Muslims as threats to Western values and claiming that pro-Palestinian protesters in Canada were seeking to implement Sharia law. So again, you see this connection between the pro-Palestinian protesters and so on, and with this connection again to this Islamophobic idea that Muslims are trying to promote Sharia law and have a takeover of Canadian society. And so these networks, there were propaganda memes that were posted on their account, and that included, the CN Tower with like a crescent moon over it as a kind of warning of the Islamization of Canada and so on, and even that it was going to infiltrate Canadian hockey. And this was sent to Canadian media, journalists, and other people with influence so that they were trying to really amplify the reach of this anti-Muslim fear-mongering campaign. And in the end, Meta stated that it closed more than 500 accounts linked to the campaign and confirmed that, quote, this network originated in Israel and primarily targeted audiences in the US and Canada. And that is just one example. My report has many other examples, similarly tracing the origins back in similar ways as well to often groups in Israel that are behind these campaigns. So there's a lot more there. So just sort of now going back to, you know, the dimensions of Islamophobia, looked at kind of the industries behind it, but the dimensions. Yep.
Jasmine, about 3 minutes.
Okay, so I'm just going to say that there are, you know, these individual ideological and systemic dimensions. For example, there are the deadly consequences of Islamophobia. We know of the terror attacks in Quebec and in London, Ontario, even the stabbing of a mosque caretaker by a neo-Nazi group. So there's been a lot of those attacks. There's a lot of hate crimes. I won't go into them all, you know, that have been happening consistently. And Dalia has talked already about some of the anti-Palestinian examples. There's ideologies that underpin all of these, and I outlined them in my report, what I call Islamophobia's playlist. But you see a lot of these ideas around Muslim invaders, civilizational jihad, Muslims are a Trojan horse, they're wolves in sheep's clothing, and so on. Demographic replacement is one of those conspiracy theories. And here's some political cartoons that were in the Jewish Tribune in November of 2007 and 2010. And this was a publication put out by B'nai B'rith Canada. And you can see here how demographic replacement conspiracies were represented in those publications. There's also, you know, we're talking a lot about these sort of, you know, groups that are actually, we would have called fringe, but are a lot more in the mainstream now in terms of their influence. But there's also been a history of very negative polling in Canada and concerns about the Muslim presence, where Muslims are, you know, Canadians are concerned about their security because of the Muslim presence. Many Canadians, almost a quarter, favored a Muslim ban in Canada, and so on. So, and about 52% of Canadians distrust Muslims. So those are some of the polls. And so we have systemic factors also behind Islamophobia. Here's a list of different kinds of racial profiling, securitization, and so on, bans on religious attire, surveillance of Muslim charities. But in closing, I want to just focus here on the campus surveillance of Muslims and the Islamophobic roots of that, because I think that's also something that is not being recognized. And so since 9/11, the RCMP cites the jihadization of Muslim youth as the greatest threat to global security. So from there, we start to see more intensive targeting, surveillance, securitization of particularly Muslim youth. And so that extended to students and campuses. So in 2003, we had students, Pakistani international students who faced pre-dawn paramilitary raids on their homes based on, you know, false information and stereotypes and so on, accusing them of threats to the nation. Over the last 2 decades, Muslim student associations, their presidents, executive members have been approached by CSIS, the RCMP, and counterterrorism units of local police. I can say my son, when he was elected president of the Muslim Student Association at his university, the next morning at 9 a.m. got a phone call from CSIS on his cell phone to talk to him about concerns that they had. And MSAs in general have been subject to this surveillance for a very long time and have been under, you know, security surveillance. A recording device was discovered in the prayer room at TMU. And of course, now we're seeing harassment of students wearing kafayas. We're seeing the doxing, threats, intimidation, class action lawsuits, as well as the, you know, policing presence, you know, rubber bullets, bomb sniffing dogs, and so on. And yesterday there was an excellent panel about with the student activists, and they also reconfirmed that it was racialized Muslim women or visible Muslim women that were facing the brunt of the surveillance, even being followed into bathrooms, and that MSA meetings were being surveilled. So this is the climate that we're facing. This is how Islamophobia underpins that climate, both on our campuses and outside of it, and hopefully has these are just some more examples of what Islamophobia at some university settings that we've seen. So I won't go into all of the examples, but hopefully this has given you a bit of a grounding in understanding how Islamophobia is really animating what we're witnessing today, that historical legacy and contemporary manifestations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, for that very comprehensive discussion. And now I will turn it over to Cheryl.
Hey, thank you, Alejandro. I just want to echo what Jasmine was saying about the watching over the last 9 months, the numbers that Dahlia brings to show us of the number of her family members who have been killed, and how watching it go up every time has been an incredible shock and a reminder of the human toll of all this. And again, my condolences to Dahlia and her family. So it's really cool to be here on Scholar Strike. I'm really excited about it. What I want to address here today is this stark divide in the Jewish community over the question of support for Israel. Excuse me. Contentious debates over what constitutes contemporary anti-Semitism are absolutely central to this divide. If we believe, and I do, that one of the fundamental principles of anti-racism is to reject any impulse to essentialize an identifiable group as sharing characteristics, appearances, behaviors, excuse me, I'm getting over the flu, or ideologies that are understood to be inherent, even biologically innate to that group, then we need to interrupt the notion, despite the claims of the institutional Jewish community, that over the question, sorry, of the institutional Jewish community. I'm very sorry. The Jews are united in their political opinions and aspirations. To put it bluntly, Jews are wildly diverse in their political opinions, origins, beliefs, behaviors, physical appearances, and political loyalties. Zionism, the 20th century political creed, claiming that only a sovereign Jewish state in historic Palestine would be able to protect Jews from anti-Semitism, has been debated and disputed by Jews for more than a century. Zionism has nonetheless become a central tenet in contemporary Jewish life. As Jewish studies scholar Shaul Magid notes, the dogma of compulsory Zionism has rendered non- or anti-Zionism an unspoken heresy within mainstream Jewish communities. So, to my great regret, Jewish communal life in Canada is dominated by organizations which, number one, claim to speak for all Jews, despite any semblance of a communal democratic process in determining their policies or actions. And indeed, while in the past, Jewish organizations benefited from the counsel of scholars and rabbis and other learned members of the community, they are now dominated by a self-selected donor class. Whereas once small donors were valued and nurtured, now multi-million-dollar donor-directed funds court the engagement of the richest and most politically influential community members. Ideological checkpoints now determine who is and who is not a legitimate Jew. What we do know is that Jews are openly demonstrating against this genocide in unprecedented numbers. In the US, Jews repeatedly occupied Grand Central Station, and hundreds blocked bridges throughout the United States, among many other Jewish-led actions to protest the destruction of Gaza. Every demonstration here in Canada has featured a large Jewish contingent. Anti-Zionist Jewish organizations such as Jewish Voice for Peace in the US and Independent Jewish Voices here in Canada, as well as other groups around the world condemning Israel's war in Gaza, have welcomed thousands of new members. In the US, a poll of Jews released last week by the liberal Zionist group J Street found that 71% of Jews did not consider criticism of how the war is being conducted to be anti-Semitic. 59% did not think that accusing Israel of war crimes is anti-Semitic, and 46% did not believe that opposing Zionism is anti-Semitic. Nonetheless, the institutional Jewish community has succeeded in persuading government and civil society actors that anti-Zionism, the rejection of racial governance in Israel-Palestine, equals anti-Semitism. So one of the ways they have done this is by promoting the adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, wherein individuals or institutions can be accused of anti-Semitism for holding opinions that can range from criticism of Israel, of the policies of the Israeli government, to denying that Israel has the right to exist as an exclusively Jewish state, even if these opinions in no way reference beliefs or expressions that have been traditionally regarded as constituting an anti-Semitic worldview. The push to adopt the IHRA, and for those of you who don't know, the federal government issued on October 31st a handbook for the implementation of the IHRA, which is a recipe for repression. I suggest you go and look at it because it is a frightening document. So, the IHRA is part of a well-funded and orchestrated Israeli government policy, which has been taken up by pro-Israel organizations in order to guarantee that Israeli violence against Palestinians is seen as Jewish defense, that annexation of Palestinian land is seen as Jewish self-determination, and that pro-Palestinian voices are effectively silenced. So despite the claim that the definition is non-legally binding, we see mounting evidence that the IHRA is being used to sanction and punish pro-Palestine scholars, students, and activists. As British-Israeli scholar Neve Gordon argues, one might say that the definition is transformed into a golem of sorts, a mystical giant and powerful creature created from clay by a famous rabbi to defend Jews from manifestations of anti-Semitism. And like the golem, who over time became extremely violent, destructive, and uncontrollable, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism has become unwieldy and is now being used as a shield, not to protect Jews, but to enable Israel to exert genocidal violence against the Palestinians and attack those who dare criticize the violence. Accusations of anti-Semitism always carry with them associations with the Holocaust and the Nazis' genocidal extermination of most of Europe's Jews. This form of defamation has been referred to as the nuclear option of political rhetoric, a bludgeon that automatically renders someone outside the realm of purported modern Western values of tolerance and civility. It's a powerful rhetoric that portrays those accused as morally defective and fits neatly into our post-9/11 world of deep Islamophobia, anti-Arabism, and anti-Palestinian racism. Israel's war in Gaza has given new life to these ideologies. Attempts to brand pro-Palestine demonstrators as anti-Semitic have been ubiquitous. Demonstrators are consistently labeled as pro-Hamas, pro-hate, Jew-hating, or as terrorist sympathizers. The imagined spectacle of rampaging mobs permeates the social media posts and the op-eds of Jewish communal spokespeople and opportunistic politicians alike. Demonstrators are painted with the same racist brush as our Palestinians, who have consistently been portrayed as barbaric and uncivilized or somehow less than human. Allegations of anti-Semitism play in the rhetoric and actions of those Jewish groups that unconditionally support Israel and who are attempting to discredit and even criminalize those who are showing up in their tens of thousands to oppose Israel's war in Gaza. This strategy is central to Israel's public diplomacy gambit, better known as Hasbara. Journalist Joshua Leifer explains, the Israeli government long ago adjusted its public relations strategy so that today the Israeli Hasbara apparatus's most active front is the attempted redefinition of anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, with the goal of rendering any opposition to the occupation or Zionism, or even simply Israeli policies themselves, beyond the pale of acceptability. The misleading reports on the events in Amsterdam over the weekend, whereby Israeli soccer fans who had chanted genocidal slogans and unleashed violence were seen as victims of a pogrom, are textbook cases of the weaponization of anti-Semitism. Several pro-Israel organizations worldwide collect and disseminate reports accounting for anti-Semitic incidents and levels of anti-Semitism, and we're inundated with, the notion that anti-Semitism is a raging disease happening in our society. So there's a growing dispute both in media accounts and academic research over how accurately these reports identify the sources of contemporary anti-Semitism, which is incontrovertibly growing, don't get me wrong. And consequently, whether claims of burgeoning anti-Semitism coming largely from legacy Jewish organizations are entirely credible. And you'll see links to 2 reports that I've written about this in the chat. So we learned yesterday that when political activity and expressions of anti-Israel or pro-Palestine sentiment are deemed anti-Semitic, the potential for exaggerating the threat of anti-Semitism are great. When Jewish communal institutions cite pro-Palestine speech and activism as a major source of anti-Semitism, the implication is that left-wing ideology and political action constitute the major threat to Jewish safety. However, studies in the US and Europe and here in Canada demonstrate conclusively that anti-Semitic sentiment is far more prevalent on the political right than on the political left. The fatal flaw, of course, in this line of reasoning is that emphasis on anti-Israelism as anti-Semitism threatens to divert attention away from the largest documented threat to Jewish safety, the white supremacist right. So we must resist efforts to equate the strong, empirically based criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. For the last 5 years, as a member of Independent Jewish Voices, I've helped conduct dozens of anti-Semitism trainings. I call them our anti-colonial, anti-racist, anti-Semitism trainings to a wide variety of groups in Canada based on foundational anti-racist principles and progressive Jewish scholarship that reject the anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism equation. So those principles include a recognition of the intensification of anti-Semitism as part of the endemic rise in racism in general. So we cannot separate, the rise in the escalation of racism and xenophobia throughout the West and elsewhere. And fighting and educating against anti-Semitism must be part of a larger struggle against all group hatred and discrimination. Another principle is that anti-Semitism is unique but not exceptional. Like other forms of racism, anti-Semitism has unique characteristics, but it is not an exceptional form of hatred. And these forms and these expressions all have interrelated histories that can be traced. So, and treating anti-Semitism as exceptional completely undermines the project of building solidarity with other anti-racist struggles, which is a key strategy for keeping all of us safe. Anti-Semitism is contextually specific. We challenge the idea that anti-Semitism is eternal and inevitable. Certain anti-Semitic tropes echo across centuries, but their meanings shift in relation to specific contexts. And anti-Semitism emerges in different historical periods for very different reasons, and any analysis of anti-Semitism must take the historical, political, cultural, geographic, and intellectual context into consideration. Jewish experience is diverse. Jewish experience has to be understood in all its diversity and richness, and not just as an inventory of suffering. The European Jewish experience differs substantially, for example, from that of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. And we recognize the imperative to represent the geopolitical realities of Jews and their experiences of anti-Semitism from a variety of locations. Really important one, histories of genocide, both in Europe and the global South, are intertwined. The historic persecution of Jews, including its genocidal expression in the Holocaust, should be viewed together with histories of enslavement, colonial exploitation, and the numerous other genocides committed by the West against racialized populations. And this view sees these crimes not as a deviation from, but as a central and ongoing feature of Western geopolitical domination. This approach offers an opportunity to build a politics of mutual recognition of suffering, which disavows exceptionalization and insists that the genocidal crimes of colonialism and neocolonialism be recognized alongside the Holocaust as paradigmatic examples of evil. Moreover, in an
About 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, good. Moreover, in an era of global migration, where some learners are likely to be refugees or descendants of refugees from formerly colonized territories and other political conflict zones, there is an urgent need to validate their experiences and to make connections that build mutual understanding and solidarity. And I have to say that one of my personal challenges right now is to undermine the impact of Holocaust and anti-Semitism education being delivered by Zionist organizations like the Simon Wiesenthal in the school system and to the police and to many other agencies where they are welcomed with open arms. Anti-Zionism is not necessarily anti-Semitic. Criticism of Zionism and the state or the state of Israel, which is rooted in an opposition to ethno-nationalism and based on a belief in a solution to the conflict that accords full equality to all those residing in Israel-Palestine, should not be considered anti-Semitic. However, critiques which draw on recognizable anti-Semitic notions, Jews control the media, the government, etc., must be recognized as harmful and should be distinguished from legitimate criticism of a country that has been described by several respected human rights organizations as constituting an apartheid regime, and of course, one that is carrying out a genocide. So I'll conclude by saying that when a politics of dispossession and racism is pursued in the name of protecting and defending the Jewish people, dissident Jews loudly proclaim that we are not represented by such politics. Rather, we stand with those who are murdered, imprisoned, and made homeless and stateless by these policies. This was done to us. Why are we doing it, or lending our support to those Jews who are doing it to others? We assert that it must be principles and not blood that determine where we stand. Despite what the mainstream Jewish world would have us believe, a moral, creative, and authentic Jewish life is not antithetical to support for Palestine and opposition to a Jewish ethnocracy in historic Palestine. Rather, solidarity with the Palestinian liberation struggle is fundamental to a livable Jewish future based on principles of justice, righteousness, uh, and solidarity. The dilemma for Jews in this moment is whether to choose fidelity to or betrayal of what appears to be the Jewish communal consensus. The biblical admonition to not hate your co-religionist in your heart requires speaking out rather than maintaining silence about the transgressions of our communities. For some members of my community, speaking out publicly against Israel's dispossession of and violence against Palestinian people constitutes a betrayal. However, fidelity to our community in regards to Israel can constitute betrayal of another sort, the betrayal of the moral and spiritual precepts that are central to Judaism. These fundamental precepts, which are connected to both Jewish history and religious tradition, teach us that when we Jews are obligated to engage with we Jews are obligated to engage with the struggles for liberation of others. If we deny or refuse this imperative, and when others become our victims, argues Jewish theologian Mark Ellis, the brokenness of our past is betrayed and our political empowerment is made suspect.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, for that really powerful discussion. And I just want to invite any viewers to use the chat in the YouTube to ask questions. And I would like to point out that we got a beautiful message from Manar Al-Farra, the father of Dalia. Thank you so much. I am Dr. Manar Al-Farra, the father of Dalia, and I'm so proud of my daughter and of all of you. Dalia represents all Palestinians who are not against Jews, only against Zionism. Thank you so much for joining us. What a beautiful message, and we love and appreciate Dalia so much for her strength and the model that she gives us. I have to say that many times this past year, I have been very close to breaking down, and it is people like Dalia and other Palestinian friends, both here and in Palestine, who make me realize that I must continue, that we all must continue this work. And I'm so grateful to have you among our viewers today. So I'm last up. I'll try to. Sorry, Dalia. Yeah,
I didn't
please.
expect that. I wouldn't have turned my camera on. Thank you, Alejandro.
Yeah, of course. So I'm going to just share my screen. Okay. Going to keep track of time as well. Okay, so I'll try to be as quick as possible. I've hopefully shortened mine enough that we'll still have time for a few questions. So for my contribution today, I want to do two things. Discuss briefly the approach that we developed at the Jewish Faculty Network for thinking about anti-Semitism, and then from a historical perspective, place the arrival of this term, the new anti-Semitism, which is now codified in what Cheryl was talking about as the IHRA working definition, and place it in its relation to the settler colonial project that continues to unfold under the state of Israel. So first, I just want to remark upon how this panel has been put together, because here we have speakers with expertise to address a range of interconnected racisms and bigotry, not just one. And that's a really important approach. I think Dalia mentioned this, Cheryl mentioned this, and Jasmine mentioned this, each in their own way, to not isolate one form of bigotry or racism. This work is crucial because it suggests an approach to anti-Semitism that is needed now more than ever. Racisms of any kind cannot be treated in isolation, even as they are unique. They need to be dressed together to overcome the systemic conditions that produce them. And this intellectual work is needed now more than ever because together we can help create the world where Palestinians and Israelis can live together in peace, freedom, and equality. And we know that Palestine will return to being whole and as part of a vibrant Mashriq. If someone cannot speak about anti-Semitism on the same panel as others are speaking about Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism, we should ask why. Why should we treat anti-Semitism as a unique form of racism or bigotry or as an exceptional form? Too often, the most vocal advocates or supporters of the State of Israel, here in Canada as well as elsewhere in the world, seek to address anti-Semitism as if it is a unique or preeminent form. They do not want to place it alongside other forms of racism and bigotry, as Cheryl was suggesting. If they did put it in a more general approach to combat all forms of racism and bigotry, they would be forced to contend with their own Islamophobia and anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian racism. And Jasmine's discussion of the Islamophobia network showed some of that. And certainly they would be forced to contend with a long history of such racism in the actions and statements of Israeli leaders. So this is part of that unholy alliance that Jasmine mentioned. We're already seeing the effects of this challenge. Israel lobby organizations like CIJA are freaking out to discover that they are the ones who are trucking in racist stereotypes, right? They're challenging the very idea that there is such a thing called anti-Palestinian racism. And it's high time that they think through their own racism. For my second contribution to our discussion, I'm going to focus on the emergence of the concept, the new anti-Semitism, and link it in a preliminary way to the settler colonial project of the Israeli state. Here, I'm relying on, especially on the work of Amy Kaplan, John Mearsheimer, and Stephen Walt, and Anthony Lerman about the history of the concept, and on the other hand, actually on my own reading of the history of Palestine, Israel. Now, as Cheryl was mentioning, the idea of the new anti-Semitism was codified, that is, given its strongest official definition through the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition that my colleague, Cheryl mentioned earlier, that is the golem that has been kind of being used to censor. I want to add one thing to discussions about the IHRA working definition that I think is not flagged enough. And that is the institutional use of the concept. The organized proponents of the new anti-Semitism, what Mearsheimer and Walt call the Israel lobby, want to be the official arbiters of what counts as anti-Semitism under this concept. So we hear a lot of talk about adopting a definition or the IRA definition. But the question of the definition is actually, from my perspective, a red herring. What the proponents of IHRA or other definitions are really talking about is who gets to be the judge. These proponents don't want to acknowledge that there is a debate among Jewish experts and leaders about the concept. They just want you and all of us to accept their authority. They thus want to make themselves judges of anti-Semitism and institutionalize a certain concept of anti-Semitism in a quasi-legal manner. So it's that institutional form rather than the definition itself that is the form of censorship, which also betrays a lot of anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobia. Now, I'd like to examine the relation of the concept of the new anti-Semitism to the history of the State of Israel. I can't go through this in detail, but it isn't possible to understand the legitimation of the State of Israel without thinking through a history of racisms and racial hierarchies that are implemented through colonial regimes. So historically, like the Canadian state, the State of Israel is a settler colonial endeavor that emerged out of the British colonial state, and it maintains several aspects of that colonial apparatus. This isn't exceptional. We don't single out the State of Israel, but prevalent. In Canada, the US, etc., and many post-colonial states have integrated some of the colonial institutions into their systems of rule and continue to use them oppressively. That is, we have not fully decolonized, and full decolonization is a difficult process to achieve. I'd like now to describe the historical context for the initial appearance of the term the new anti-Semitism. It's useful to quickly discuss the beginnings of the settler colonial project of the Zionist organizations. There's a long, complex history of violent and virulent anti-Semitism in the 19th century that led some, actually a minority, of Jewish leaders to argue that there's only one answer to the Jewish question of Europe. Essentially, the proponents of political Zionism came to agree, ironically, with anti-Semites. With the failure of Jewish assimilation in Europe, and in order to finally become European, the idea was that Jews need to become settlers outside of Europe. So to become European meant you had to settle outside of Europe. They thought that Jews needed to establish a homeland outside of Europe, and many European Zionists wanted that homeland to be in Ottoman Palestine. Now, this wasn't possible until Palestine was no longer under the Ottomans, that is, until the British conquest in 1917 and the establishment of a colonial mandate over Palestine. That is when Zionist organizations could concentrate their energies on settling. This period under British colonial rule and the establishment of the British colonial state over Palestine allowed for the building up of Zionist settlement and institutions of rule, and then during the 1948 war, the expulsion and exile of upwards of 750,000 Palestinian Arabs, a moment known by Palestinians as the Nakba. On the morrow of the Nakba, the State of Israel formed on approximately 78% of what was Mandate Palestine, and managed to gain international recognition for that phase of the settler colonial project. And there's a kind of tragedy of history here where the Jewish question of Europe led to the question of Palestine. I'd like to next jump to the 1967 war, or the Nakba, when Israelis conquered new lands from Egypt, Jordan, and Syria with more expulsions and exile, and some lands were subsequently returned in a peace agreement with Egypt. At that moment, the Israeli government immediately moved its system of military rule, which it had over Palestinians who became citizens in 1948 Israel. So they moved that system of military rule from the 1948 territories to the 1967 territories, and would not ever consider making Palestinians who lived under its military rule citizens. Now, the 1960s were an important period of global decolonization, and here what we're talking about is another moment where the Israelis actually want to get legitimation for their settler colonial expansion and deep dispossession of Palestinians, right? But the 1960s was a different moment. There was the emergence of the New Left, new civil rights movements, and criticisms of US imperial actions, especially in Vietnam. You had the establishment of the Palestine, or the establishment and emergence of the Palestine Liberation Organization as a separate entity that became the representative of the Palestinian people. But something else happened in the 1960s, which Amy Kaplan has described for the US, but I suspect it is generalizable for North Atlantic countries more generally, so Europe and North America. Israel became a hero in dominant US public opinion. This happened during a time when there were huge debates about American imperialism during the Vietnam War, especially in the context of the Cold War between the US-led order and the Soviet-led sphere. Speaking about the Israeli victory in 1967, Kaplan writes, "The dramatic action of Israeli soldiers averting apocalypse had a cathartic effect, that is, on American public opinion. In Israel's swift victory over Soviet allies, especially Egypt and Syria, Americans could vicariously experience both the dread of vulnerability and the thrill of invincibility, the irrefutable victory that was eluding them in Vietnam." So it's in this context that a term emerges, the new anti-Semitism, or sometimes functional anti-Semitism, right? So in this new moment of decolonization, and with the emergence of new civil rights movements, new leftist movements that are criticizing imperialism and settler colonial expansion, like that of the Israeli state into the 1967 territories of Palestine. As Lerman shows, after the 67 war, and with the growing support for so-called Zionism is Racism UN resolution, which led to the first round of redefining and discussing criticisms of the Israeli state as anti-Semitic. That is, the concept of the new anti-Semitism arose as a response to criticism of a new phase in the Israeli settler colonial project to expand its settlement, in particular to the West Bank, including, of course, East Jerusalem, although also to Gaza and other conquered territories. So, for example, an early expression by Israel's then foreign minister, Abba Evan, who stated, "Recently we have witnessed the rise of the new left, which identifies Israel with the establishment, with acquisition, with smug satisfaction, with, in fact, all the basic enemies. Let there be no mistake. The new left is the author and the progenitor of the new anti-Semitism." So imagine this tumult of new ideas that are emerging in this moment that are criticizing racisms and sexism and all kinds of homophobic, anti-queer ideas. This new moment when so much is emerging that is important to our civil society. Abba Evans sees it as all the fount of a new anti-Semitism. One of the chief tasks of any dialogue with the Gentile world is to prove that the distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is not a distinction at all. Anti-Zionism is merely the new anti-Semitism, so we're hearing echoes and repetitions of this right now in this moment. The old classic anti-Semitism declared that equal rights belong to all individuals within the society except the Jews. The new anti-Semitism says that the right to establish and maintain an independent national sovereign state is the prerogative of all nations so long as they happen not to be Jewish, which is of course a kind of red herring, because what Abba Evan actually wants is legitimacy for the expansion of the Israeli settler colonial project over the lands that were conquered in 1967, which we're now seeing a new phase, an intensified phase of genocide to try to dispossess Palestinians even more. Of course, mostly in Gaza Strip, we're seeing the intensification, but it's also happening across the rest of Palestine. Lerman argues that the final codification of this concept came later, with events after 9/11 and the Second Intifada, and then finally with the IHRA working definition. And interestingly, this is the same time frame that Jasmine mentioned, and in this kind of post 9/11 world. So, quick conclusion: evidence-based discussion of an ongoing settler colonial enterprise is not anti-Semitism. It is a legitimate criticism central to any decolonization process. And this panel and the scholars' strike that was called for these 2 days is important work. It is hard work. And we need to be able to speak and argue about legitimate political positions without being intimidated by the threat of being called anti-Semitic. Thank you so much. And I now call on our panelists. Going to figure out how to stop share. There we go. Okay. I'm just going to look to see if there are questions. So there's a question about decolonization and the right of return for all in one state as it should have been from the beginning, and righteousness and equality. And that's kind of in response to my saying decolonization is difficult to achieve. So any thoughts on decolonization and how it relates to these issues of anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobia, anti-Semitism? Maybe we can go in order. Dalia, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think it's I mentioned it a bit in my presentation, the importance of identifying the settler colonialism framework that we're working with, and the fact that it's not just a religious struggle, or not a religious struggle, and having that framework and that lens is important in understanding the situation, the oppression, the injustice that's happening on the ground there, and how it translates into the diaspora and the treatment of Palestinians and their supporters. How it can be achieved, I wish I had the answer to that. It's very challenging, and honestly, I'm very cynical because colonists support colonists, colonizers support colonizers, and the fact that the entire world order seems to be stacked against the liberation and justice for Palestinians makes me even more cynical.
Thanks so much. So I'm just told that we have just a few more minutes. So some words from Jasmine and then Cheryl, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, thank you. I mean, look, decolonial struggles, colonialism itself is Islamophobia has been intimately connected with the colonial project from its inception in Muslim countries globally. And so there's a lot of similarity there in the way those projects were justified and the way that they leveraged Islamophobia, and in the justification of those missions, that was also heavily a racial project as well. So we can't ignore those roots at all. In terms of decolonization, I think it is something that we need to continue to grapple with. I don't think that's something that we're going to be able to resolve, especially in the next couple of minutes. But I think it is, because it's part of the equation, it's also part of the solution. And we just need to talk about that and make sure that in the context of what we're dealing with here, things like the IRA definition coming back as a Trojan horse now within universities, even though faculty associations have voted against it. We need to keep leveraging the decolonial and anti-racist arguments that we had to the implementation of the IRA. So I'll just leave it with that.
So much, Jasmine. Cheryl, last word.
Okay, quickly. I think that I always look for the local challenge. What is the local challenge, and how do we do that? Because that's where we have the most impact, I think. And I think that, I go back to the Saidian notion of the permission to narrate, that we are facing, I think we're facing an immense new wave of repression coming. And I've given a few talks on this before, I won't go into it now. But, part of that will be to silence in academia, for example, the way Palestine gets taught, the way anti-Semitism gets taught. And this is where we really need to be putting, I mean, for me, it's a huge priority that we need to keep those channels open and fight like hell to resist the repression that will be coming down on us. And if you read the IHRA implementation report, you'll see that there are many, many ways in which that conversation can be and probably will be shut down. So I just urge everybody to look locally and see what can you do to decolonize at the very local level, because that's what we're entrusted to do, I think, those of us who are fighting against this.
Thank you all so much. I feel so privileged to be on this panel with such brilliant people and people who I admire so much. And thank you all to our audience for coming and for your support. And thank you again to Scholars Strike Canada. Hope to see you soon in better times.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you to Scholars Strike. Always a privilege to be with this company.
Indeed. Oh, you're done.
Okay, the live stream has ended now. Thank you all so much. It was an incredible panel. We really appreciate you.